Right, so welcome everyone. This is the Netcall Gov 4.0 questions to ask and best practice to adopt when looking at acquiring and implementing robotic process automation. So this Q&A, which will be facilitated by my good self, will consider the pros and cons of RPA as a means of promoting rapid process improvement. So the guys from Netcall are also going to suggest questions you might want to ask as you consider the project. So we'll just move on from there. So I'd like to introduce to you, they've already introduced themselves, but I'll introduce them once again. We've got Richard Billington, Chief Technology Officer at Netcall, and then we've got Mr. Simon Pike, who is the Market Solutions Specialist from Netcall. So welcome, gentlemen. Right, we're going to get straight into the nitty-gritty, and I think this one is to you, Richard.
Yep.
And I was actually going to, I do know a bit about RPA, but I was going to go onto Wikipedia this morning and then do a big diatribe about what RPA was. And then thankfully, you're the Chief Technology Officer. You're the man that's going to know what is RPA and how does it help councils.
Yeah, so we tried to boil it down. Obviously, there's a load of different descriptions out there, and some of them are specific to the vendors that are implementing or wish to implement the technology. So at the most simplest level, robotics process automation, RPA, is a digital worker. It's literally as simple as that. Rather than a human individual going through a process that you've defined, some software will do it instead. And I think one of the attendees mentioned earlier, how do you then justify an ROI, a return on your investment? Well, it simply is the cost of that robot working through that process, completing that automation. Is that cheaper than having a human do that? And when you consider that a robot, a piece of software, can work 24/7 and probably at a speed and accuracy that a human may not be able to achieve, then you can understand where the benefits will come. So it's not an actual robot, as you'll see in probably every vendor's collateral. There's those little robot arms, as you can see there, jutting in from the left or right of the screen. It's obviously not an actual robot. It's a piece of software running on a computer. It allows an automation to be captured, and that automation is a series of steps that need to be performed. So it might be logging into one piece of software, abstracting some information, taking that somewhere else, performing a search, doing that search and writing the results off to another piece of software. And that's something that a human could obviously do on their computer, on their workstation, for a council or indeed any other organisation. But where it's maybe a repetitive piece of work, maybe mundane work that you might otherwise be able to get your staff to do something of higher value, then being able to automate that and get a piece of software to run that process, can provide clear benefits. And what we've seen more recently is those RPA bots are now incorporating other software, such as artificial intelligence. So rather than the bot being dumb, if you like, and following a set of very specific instructions, it can now use AI to read information in, to interpret a result, and then do something based on that result. And then you really start to sort of work your way up the value chain as a result. Those digital workers can do more complicated work, and therefore you can give them more than your mundane repetitive steps. And when RPA was initially deployed, it was used for legacy integration. That was certainly one of the main sort of primary use cases initially, but we're seeing it used across a huge range of use cases now. We've got a hospital customer, for example, that has built a bot that will go through the medical records of that hospital's patients looking for the early signs of diabetes. So it will just search your medical record, it will look for 2 or 3 flags, and then it will call that medical record out to a doctor to say, it's one that I believe could be an early risk of diabetes. So that kind of value work that you can't really expect a doctor to ever get to do because they've got all of their day job to do, could ultimately save a life. So it's way more valuable than just some of the more basic use cases that we saw initially.
Excellent, excellent. Does anybody within the audience at this very moment in time wish to ask a question? If you do, unmute. I'm going to give you probably a few seconds to unmute and just ask a question. If not, I'm going to move on. So does anyone have a question at that point, or is it all fairly self-explanatory? Does everyone now realise that there aren't little robots running around, but it's pieces of code?
We lost Nick.
I was going to say, have we lost Nick, or
Nick?
we're waiting for questions?
Well, so Stephen Curtis here. Could I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So two things really. First of all, just something about its. I mean, you might be going on to address these points. So
yep.
You are, but the first one, Netcall is obviously a low-code platform and a very good one, I might add.
Thank you.
Having deployed it. So presumably the robotic process automation element here is about that point about where you are going to engage with another platform, and therefore, and also almost needing to have the artificial intelligence side of it to sit alongside it, because you don't quite know how that's going to behave when you engage with the platform. And the second part of my, sorry, I should just get both out straight away.
Yeah,
so
go ahead. Yeah.
Very different question. The example you used was early signs of diabetes and actually trying to look for those signs. Almost the most difficult, but it sounds absolutely fabulous. But for me, almost the most difficult part of that is how you introduce that to the people that it affects. Because by definition, you're going to have to run over their data in order to identify people. Operationally, how you deploy that seems to me quite a tricky thing.
Yeah. So to your first point, one of the reasons that we acquired an RPA vendor and have folded that into our platform is because they are very complementary. So you mentioned with low code, you can build your portals, you can build your applications that you can deploy for your citizens in your case, and you will still need your council employees to ultimately then process the work that comes through those portals and those apps. And we found that organisations that already deployed our platform were then engaging with RPA vendors so that those digital workers could process that work where it was appropriate. So it felt like adding RPA into our platform would be very complementary. And indeed, we've seen in the last 12 months a new marketing phrase emerge referred to as hyper-automation. So this is essentially the convergence of 2 or 3 automation technologies into a single platform, a single ecosystem, and it's being referred to as hyper-automation. And that typically always includes case management, BPM platforms, RPA, artificial intelligence, and then thereafter the definition gets a little bit more varied, and you will see people that will include process mining, advanced analytics. So there's a range of others, but really I think hyperautomation at its heart has, or seems to have, BPM, case management, low code, RPA, and artificial intelligence. So we felt that if that was the way the market was going, and we could see our own customer base using our technology alongside other vendors that were supplying those other pieces, then it made sense to try and bring that into our platform, because we could remove the friction of integration between 2 different vendors and allow it all to work seamlessly together. Now, the hospital example is a very good one, mainly because it's a little bit left field. You see most case studies and use cases for RPA being around, like you said, legacy integrations, just the processing of the mundane repetitive work that a human would otherwise do. But I liked that hospital example because they sort of went a step further. They incorporated some AI. But I think a key point is at no point would that the output from that digital worker go directly to a patient. So it was a case of flagging that record as being one that would then be reviewed by a human with that expertise, in this case a doctor. And that is a really key point when it comes to sort of, you know, governance around the way in which you might implement digital workers, and really actually more so artificial intelligence, because you know, there clearly needs to be an element of human empathy with something like that. You can't just start emailing or messaging patients to say you might have the early, you know, onset diabetes. That would never be the case. I think anyone who was trying to implement it, you know, it feels like you would never go that far. But by doing that, again, sort of the grunt work of just analysing all of that data, applying artificial intelligence to it, and just flagging a patient record up as somebody who then needs that verification, seems really sensible, because the doctor would never get through the amount of work that would otherwise be needed. But if you can highlight the ones that, you know, that need that review, giving the doctor a much smaller sample set to have to analyze, then the chances of identifying those patients and potentially saving them their, you know, maybe even saving lives in the long term, seem very valid. Nick, you're back.
I am, yeah. My internet went down. So yeah, seat your pants, yeah, seat the pants moment. Anyway, it's back up now, as you can see. Thank you, Stephen Curtis, for asking a question and almost allowing me to get back in time. So
Been borrowing Dave Briggs's internet again.
Yeah. So, are there any other questions? No, but I thought that was excellently responded to. So, Simon, over to you now. So where do you see RPA having the biggest impact within councils?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I think that RPA is still a relatively new term in the public sector industry. It's something that's perhaps more common to the commercial sector than public sector. But as Richard highlighted, you know, there are areas in health where it's becoming very, very well used. And I see the same happening down local authority levels. I think there is a correlation between what Richard talked about at the hospital and early onset of diabetes. You know, there's correlations there to things in the education sector within local government, for example. You know, where you look at things like exclusion records, special needs, attendance rates, performance rates in schools to potentially identify children that might go down the route of being at risk and vulnerable. So there are correlations there that could be used to that. But I think it is becoming something that is more thought about and more aware of within councils. That said, there are some challenges to that to see where this can add value. You know, there's one example that I've talked about, but there are essentially two ways that you can have an impact. So there's the first one of these is this process that we've set up on the screen called unattended RPA, and then the second one is an attended RPA. And I'll just talk a little bit about the difference between the two. So unattended is where you might have, say, system A required to pass some information off to system B as part of a workflow, or where data has previously been entered manually. So you might have to rekey some information in two different applications. So that's where that can work very well. That can be done via RPA, and even when APIs might be available from vendors, you could still use RPA. It might be that the APIs are not up to date or potentially expensive. We know some suppliers, you know, potentially charge money for APIs, and RPA provides an alternative to that. And examples would be, you know, as we say, passing information to back office processing, integration, or even data mining, as we talked about there, and the example that I used within, you know, education, where that might help. The second one is an attended approach. This has an element of human interaction required. So the example that we like to use here might be, say, on the front line, where an agent receives a phone call and they need to go and retrieve a rent balance from a back office system. So they go through an actual process of going, right, I need to get that data, relaying that information back to their customer, and then taking a payment. So those would be, you know, that attended. There's an actual human step there, rather than just letting the system go and do the work for you. And that, you know, that covers that front office activity, and that's that human in the loop type of approach, involving them within there and doing that request alongside the customer being on the phone. You're on mute, Nick.
Any questions for Simon at all on any of that you've just heard? Can we move on? Let's have a look at the pros and cons then. And that's you again, Simon. Well, here are the benefits, cautions and questions. Run us through them and elaborate on them.
Yeah, okay. So let's have a quick look at the benefits. So the RPA can help to introduce efficiencies into existing processes by removing some of the manual intervention often required when dealing with your citizens, whether this be reducing the need to rekey information, or as I've talked about already, or simply accessing information from another system without having access to the system and search for a record yourself. This makes it ideal in that sense to help manage high volume tasks that might have taken a number of members of staff some time to complete. Using the robot, in this sense of the virtual robot, as Richard said earlier on, this frees up those members of staff to help them focus on more critical work and critical tasks, and can introduce those efficiencies into the whole process. Them doing that digital job for you frees you up naturally to go on to do other things, as I say. When we come to cautions, so it's not, it won't alone enable digital transformation. I think that's quite key. Like any technology solution, RPA is simply an enabler. It's not a tool for digital transformation, if that makes sense. Digital transformation is about reviewing your processes and looking for improvements. If you're just going to take it as it is, if it's a poor process already, introducing RPA or low code to that extent isn't going to improve the process. That alone isn't going to introduce your efficiencies. It's still going to be a poor process. So you've got to look at that remodeling and that collaboration across your organisation to deliver that overall improved service, and then look for the right technology. And in some scenarios, RPA will fit the bill perfectly, but in others, it won't necessarily be the right tool for the job. It might be a low code solution. It might be using APIs. And it's about understanding that and using the right tool for the right job. As we've said, it's about managing the high level jobs and identifying those and using that tool to deliver those. But as I say, if there are flaws in the process and you just take a like for like, it will still have flaws in it. If we come on to things to think about asking when you're going to market or when you're asking your organisation. So the first thing is, are we just doing a lift and shift? As I say, it won't introduce efficiencies. It isn't really digital transformation. If you have, however, buy-in from the council to digital transformation, then that means that there's an acceptance that remodelling will be necessary, and then identifying the right tool to do that. It's not a one-time piece of work, though. Digital transformation is continuous. You don't do it and go, right, we've done that, let's move on to the next thing. It doesn't stop. It's a continual process as the world around us changes. I think if nothing else this last year has taught us, is that that's how we have to be. We have to adapt to the situation, adapt to the environment that we're working in, and move with the times and remodel as you go. And any good solution will help you to support that. I think there's a danger or a risk that RPA could be seen as a silver bullet to all your problems. And again, it's about understanding where that can have the biggest impact. It's mindful that you've got to support your business case, thinking about the specifics of what you're trying to solve, and identifying that right solution. There's a phrase that I read, which is that to a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to do the right job. So it's about looking at it and going, right, where's the right thing? Where's the right technology? What are we trying to solve? Identifying those risks up front and looking at that. I think it also depends who it is that's asking for the solution. Is it your IT team? Is it your digital transformation team? Making sure that they're working together to collaborate and get things done right, which kind of leads us on to looking at the people that are at the coalface. What is the job that they're actually doing? Working with them, getting them to engage, getting them to take part in the design process, getting them to engage in the technology. And I think if you do that, then you'll get a greater degree of success out of this. Now that applies to any technology solution, not just RPA, obviously, but certainly is relevant within there. And to understand that as part of that process, what people think is the process isn't necessarily the process, if that makes sense. And there'll always be stages where you go, well, that's the way we've always done it. But I think those are the key things where you have to pick those out and go, right, okay, so why have you done it that way? Looking at the big picture now, is there a better way to do that? Introducing RPA into that and going, right, does this change the way that that has to work and can work? And can we make efficiencies through that? And then, as I say, supporting that ongoing. It's not just a one-time thing. It's got to be agile. It's got to be adaptive. You've got to be able to look at it and go, right, okay, that's fine for now. But in 6 months, 12 months time, things might change. How do you evolve? How do you change that process as you go through? And not just going, right, we've done that job, we've done the job, we've introduced RPA, there you go, off you go and use it, and never being involved again. You've got to support that. And perhaps more with the digital workers, that's perhaps a little bit more key, because you need to be involved with them, you need to see what they're doing, you need to monitor them, I think, and make sure that they're still doing the right things in the right way. And that's, that's the same as a physical worker, as a digital worker, I think.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, in terms of one of the benefits, I think the organisations that we saw that had RPA in place pre the first lockdown were able to immediately deploy that to address points of friction within their processes that maybe weren't even clear when we were all sat in offices and we could just shout across the room or take a bit of paper over or quickly send an email and have a discussion. It's a tool within a toolkit, and it's very good at eliminating those points of friction between process steps. Now, implementing RPA to achieve that for a lot of those organisations brought them time, and they could take a step back. They could look at the process from a slightly higher point of view and just say, right, if we were now going to digitally reimagine this to deliver it in a slicker, better, quicker way, then how would we do it? But they weren't doing that off the back of trying to deal with an immediate problem at the same point. They'd sort of put the fire out and gave themselves the time to then use maybe the correct tool. Because, RPA, someone mentions there, as a sticking plaster. Very true. We see that all over the place. We've got an immediate problem. We can put some RPA in. It can resolve that issue. It's not necessarily the right long-term tool that you would use if you were designing that process from scratch, blue sky thinking, clean piece of paper. And therefore, resolve yourself the issue to give yourself the time to then go back and digitally transform properly. And I think the organisations that had it as a tool and were able to do that, gave themselves given the ability to have that time to deal with the first wave of the pandemic without everything breaking and those bottlenecks being presented.
Well, I was going to throw out, and I think I'm going to throw it open to questions. So if you've got any questions there for Simon, if you could unmute and put your camera on, but just quickly, because I think I was going to ask a quick question. I think to a certain degree, Richard, you've answered a bit of it there, but I was actually going to, I usually talk about, when we talk about digital transformation, you tend to take the digital off first, and you talk about transformation, are you looking at the process first, and then once you've re-engineered it to the best process it can be, then you look at the technology. But I guess with RPA, and certainly, in times of crisis, you might just stick it straight on, put it straight through. But and that, what I was going to ask, because obviously it is quicker and accurate, but when it says at speed, how much quicker is it than a human? Do you know, is there any sort of market calculations or?
Oh, market calculations is a good one. I'm sure there is. I haven't got one off the top of my head. I suppose the most obvious benefit is they don't need comfort breaks. They work 24 hours a day. They don't take holidays, and their accuracy never falters. So as long as you've created that automation correctly in the first place, the robots will typically work as fast as the systems they're interacting with. Right. So if we are searching within a legacy system and we know that search takes 2 seconds, then the robot's going to need 2 seconds to do it. But the difference is the robot will receive the results of that search and would immediately execute the next step.
Right.
And therefore, when you're doing that across a 24-hour period, you're obviously going to get, huge benefits as a result.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, we'll go to Ange and then Stephen. So Ange, your question?
I've got two, if that's okay.
I'll go for it.
Yeah, right. First one, mentioned earlier on the potential of using RPA as an alternative to an API. I remember hearing rumours quite some time ago, possibly now, that certain suppliers were writing exclusion exclusion clauses into their contracts to prevent you from doing that because it was damaging their sales of APIs. Is that still a thing, or has that been dealt with now?
It may well be a thing with some software suppliers, and if it is, I would say you should be asking the software supplier why they're prohibiting you to achieve value from the implementation of their software. I mean, I would say you'll see less and less of that moving forward because everything is going open API, and that's true across industry. Software that doesn't deliver APIs, or software that charges you extra for access to APIs, will start to come unstuck against the competitors that are more open. You're right, that was typically a legacy problem. I'm hearing less of it now, but probably the audience here, are speaking to vendors way more than I am. So it'd be good to hear if anyone else is still seeing that as an issue. But my gut feel says you'll get that less and less. Indeed, even the notion of charging for access to APIs is starting to diminish because other vendors are coming in and use it as a point of differentiation, offering free access, because it's ultimately your software. You've paid to implement it. It's your data within it. To then charge you for API access to that, it's not right, is it? It's just a way to increase revenues, and I think you'll find that will happen less and less.
Okay.
And a couple of years ago we did a Revs and Bens event, and there was certainly two very well-known back office providers that were sending out letters saying if you used a third-party RPA product, then your support and maintenance contract would be null and void.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're still doing it, but I'm sure everyone can, can imagine who it is. But go on. What was your second question?
Second question related to more the ethical side of things. We're talking about effectively replacing staff who are carrying out very mundane tasks of things like rekeying data from one system to another with robotics. However, those staff, they are people, they are employees, and if we remove that type of work, we're appointing staff to those roles that essentially have that sort of level of capability, and we're paying them for that level of capability. So although in theory you can start upskilling people and putting them into more engaging work, some of them don't want that. Some of them are comfortable and have capability that fits there. How are you dealing with what are you experiencing in terms of the ethical side around that sort of thing, and how are other people dealing with that?
It can be tricky. I mean, I don't know of any of our organisations that have implemented RPA or indeed our Loco platform and used it as a way to get rid of staff. They've always managed to redeploy them, to upskill them, to get them doing more valuable work. Now, that's not to say it hasn't happened at all, or maybe they've actually managed to implement the technology as a way of not having to hire additional staff to deal with increased volumes or changes to the way that we as citizens interact with our councils post-pandemic or during pandemic. We're clearly not going to be walking into offices anymore. We might be doing more online. That online work might create more cases, and maybe they've implemented RPA and low code as a way of dealing with that increased level of digital casework that they would have otherwise had to redeploy or employ individuals to perform. But it does present a question outside even of RPA and digital working, just of robots and their uses to us as humans more widely. I think you can look back historically, and when robots were introduced to car manufacturing lines, everyone said there'd be that'd be the end of humans involved in car manufacturing, and it hasn't really panned out that way, in the same way that the spinning jenny cotton manufacturing was going to be the end, and no one would have jobs anymore, and ultimately we evolved the workforce to fill in the gaps that are required. So we've seen a lot of frontline workers that have been redeployed to actually utilise the RPA technology or to utilise the low code. They've been upskilled, retrained, and therefore they again haven't been let go. But it is a great question. It doesn't just apply to RPA as a technology, software, digital workers. It applies to the use of robots across industry. I haven't got the answer. I know that much. Sorry, it's a huge question. It's how do we reskill our workforce for the 21st and 22nd centuries?
Yeah.
You know, we will be doing less manually. That I think is without a doubt, and it brings even into question concepts like, you know, universal credit, where we just pay all humans a salary for doing nothing. And I know some of the Nordic countries have investigated that, you know, hugely. It's a real theoretical question.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ange. Stephen, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. I think my first, so I've got 2 points as well again. My first one is actually related to that last point that Angela was making, because I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about it's not a one-off, let's do it, that's job done, because what you're hinting at there is actually a different way of working, you know, creating an agile organization. So at a level, you look at a process, you make some changes, you see how that process goes, you make some more changes, etc. You're trying to continually improve once you get into that cycle. And so I think there is a bigger responsibility for us to think about what does that organization look like in the future, because it may be that we have a shift of resources from people who were just doing data entry into a different sort of role. We try and make a different sort of organization. And a good example is, you know, if we're trying to reduce volumes through the telephone channel, well, you know, I know, in fact, something we're starting to do where I am at the moment is take CSAs who deal with those phone calls and put them into some of the more basic management of the platform that we're using to improve web content and, you know, those kinds of things. It's a different model in which we can redeploy resource into trying to support that continually improving model. So I suppose my first question is actually about the resource input, because the model of using something like RPA strikes me as something you perhaps put more resource into to keep it going, along with the other platforms that are associated with it. And then there's 2 kind of related questions. One about, can you utilize the RPA technology to handle problems that you might have in data quality? Because I could see data quality be something that would make it break. So can it be configured to handle that? And then the other part of it is actually about knowledge handover. So we might try and get support from the likes of yourselves, Netcall, to initially implement RPA, but is this actually something that's quite a simple product to implement, or is there a knowledge handover element of it? You know, so where, for example, you might do APIs. Actually, if you put an API in, unless you've got some quite good technical skills in your teams, it can actually stop you as an organization being able to make the maximum benefit of a low-code platform, because you don't want to break that API. So is RPA actually quite simple, or do we have to also rethink our relationship with the likes of yourselves as vendors in needing to have ongoing support on the more technical side of things, particularly if you're a small organization? Sorry, lots of questions there, but anyway.
Well, and I think a couple you've come on to the next slide almost perfectly, I think, as well, in terms of what questions should a council ask of a supplier, because you're right. In terms of data quality, I think any software solution lives and dies by the quality of the data that comes in and out of it. If the quality of the data isn't there, then everything else that follows can potentially be flawed. So that is an absolute key point. And to understand the quality of data within a piece of software, you've got to be able to write software to validate it. So can you come up with a set of instructions that a low-code platform, an RPA robot, or indeed a traditional piece of software development can step through to validate the quality of that data? And sometimes actually you need human input at that point, which is where maybe the human in the loop RPA might be more valuable. And we've seen that implemented certainly within some of our contact center customers, where they will initiate an automation. That automation might come up with, let's say, 2 addresses for that individual that's called into the contact center. So it's searched a couple of back office systems, it's found 2 addresses rather than 1. So we've got a data quality issue there. We can present that to the agent to say, validate with the customer which is their correct address, and then we can go off and update that address correctly in all of our back office systems so everything matches. And I think that is a great example of the use of RPA that does involve a human making the ultimate decision, or as the human is the ultimate validator of the truth. Because, like I say, any piece of software is only as good as the individuals that have written it, and therefore the option to drop out to engage with a human is very valuable at that point. In terms of RPA and your reliance on a vendor, very good question. Already within the RPA market, there's a variability to the skill set that's required to implement it and to utilize it. So I know that to our point of view, and to the first question on the next slide, actually, one of the first things we would ask any organisation evaluating RPA is how easy is this to use as a citizen developer, so somebody without a traditional development background. At what point can I move from the drag and drop interface that a lot of RPA software has? How far can I get with that before I have to drop into code? And if that is actually very quickly, then really what you're implementing is something that an IT developer needs to use. And how many IT developers have you got that sat there with nothing else to do? I'm assuming you're all going to say not very many, and therefore you're losing the ability to empower citizen developers or the business and the business departments themselves. And I would say that will stunt your ability to roll out RPA and achieve a potential ROI as a result. So the reason that we acquired the organisation that we did, and I can only talk about our software obviously, we chose that because it was aimed at non-developers. So it's based on a canvas. You drag in, the automation is going to start, the automation is going to call out to this piece of software, and it's going to pass in this and get back this. It's then going to use a bit of AI, and it's going to get the result back. And at all the point, you're just dragging and dropping, and you're not coding in a traditional way. And as a result, I think more people can get involved in the delivery of RPA automations as a result, which means, assuming you've licensed the software correctly, which again is one of the other questions we'll come on to when Nick brings the deck back up. If you're not limited in terms of how many automations you can ultimately roll out, and you're maybe limited by the amount of automations or processes that an individual robot can run, because there will always be a licensing restriction somewhere, let's be honest, then hopefully you can get a lot of people in the organization creating a lot of automations, and then based on the value that those automations bring to the organization and having them automated, you can use your licensing to prioritize those as a result. So then there's one slide before that, Nick, which, yeah, that one there. So this was our list of questions that we would, I suppose, ask you to ask to any potential vendor of RPA software. So to your point, Stephen, we covered that first one, automation. Is this coding or is it drag and drop? It has to be drag and drop, I think, really, to achieve scale with your automations. But no RPA RPA vendor should tell you that it can do it. And therefore, at what point do I need to custom code? What point do I need to potentially drop in to development to achieve what I want to achieve? And understanding the points is hugely valuable. And how do I roll this out? Oh, we've gone on again. Back a slide, but how do I roll this out? So is it developers that need to automate and to roll out the automations that I create, or again, can this be done by non-technical users? Because again, your development resource is going to be limited, and has probably got a huge backlog of other work that needs to be performed within the organization. Therefore, you want to be able to push this out to non-developers. And thereafter, once I've pushed it out, how easy is it to update automations that are out there in the wild? How flexible is my ability to improve the automations that I've already created and I'm running within the business? And then how do my bots interface with AI and machine learning? So how can I bring intelligence into the bots that are deployed? Do you, as a vendor, have AI and machine learning functionality within the toolkit, or do I need to go off and procure that with a different third party? And if so, how does my RPA technology work with my AI and machine learning technology, and what friction might I get with the integrations that I need to perform? And again, is that something that non-developers can do, or is that the point that I need to engage with IT to understand how that integration works and how it can be maintained longer term? And then maximizing value. So can my one bot perform one process or many processes? So when I license a bot, am I licensing it only to do a specific RPA automation? Or certainly in the case of our software, the way that we work is you can create numerous API automations. They can all feed a queue that need to be performed, and then my bot just works its way through that queue. And when I've got a queue that's too big for one bot, I can buy a second bot or a third bot to get through that queue quicker. But we quite like that model, in that you're, like I say, you're not limited to a particular automation, because it might be that an automation, you get a lot of work based on one automation at 9 o'clock when your contact center opens, but then actually for the rest of the day, there isn't as much work. And therefore, if I'm limited in that regard, I might have bots that are sat there doing nothing. Well, that's clearly not going to be the best way to achieve a return on investment. If you've got bots that can manage and work through the automations for multiple processes, then as long as you can keep feeding that hopper at the top end, your bots will keep busy. If your bots are keeping busy, they're doing work that you'd have otherwise been paying humans to do. So I think that final one is a really key point. And we mentioned hyper automation earlier. I think, again, it was one of Stephen's questions. There is definitely a move towards hyper automation, and hyper automation will cover low code, RPA, and AI and machine learning. And therefore, we're trying to bring together the best of that within our platform. And I'm sure there are other vendors doing exactly the same. But knowing what that vendor is able to offer you as a toolkit for digital transformation is key, because otherwise you're going to be going off and you're going to be procuring things from a number of vendors, and you probably won't get the benefit of scale there. If you can get it all from one vendor and that vendor gives you everything you need, you can probably agree some attractive licensing as a result.
Excellent, thank you, Richard. And then the final question, what advice to customers when embarking on RPA projects?
I think that first one, starts small, act fast. So we spoke earlier about the fact you could use RPA to entirely digital transform a service, which is great, but organizations' ability to rip and replace at the moment is difficult. You've got distributed workforce, you're dealing with the effects of the pandemic on your citizens. Do you really want to be going to the board and saying, right, I'm going to entirely replace one of my processes at the moment? Probably not. I'm sure over time that'll be the right thing to do, but at the moment I think the ability to just drop in, put that sticking plaster, as Simon referred to it, onto a service, remove that friction, achieve a benefit, and then move on is clearly the way to go at the moment. But knowing that doesn't have to be the end aim, that the end aim is to properly transform that service, maybe using something like low code BPM case management is probably going to be the way to do that. is the way to go. Start small, act quick, achieve some benefit, move on, and then when you've picked off all the low-hanging fruit and you've saved that time and effort, then you can start to take a maybe more holistic view on the way in which you're transforming your organisation. Having a champion is important, and that champion may be an individual that goes through the training. We offer e-learning, I'm sure other vendors do as well, to be upskilled, to fully understand when and where RPA should be used. Because again, no one piece of software is a panacea, a silver bullet. You don't want to use one thing for everything. Knowing the right time to use RPA versus low code versus any other software genre is absolutely key, because otherwise you'll just be using what you've got, and that isn't always the right tool for the right job. So get someone trained up, make them the champion within your organization, the RPA expert that can involve others, can upskill and engage others within the business to ensure that you're using the right tool for the right job. And as always, involve IT from the start. If you keep them on the sidelines and then you come to them and say you're going to do this, that and the other, you'll get their backup, right? Human nature. If you involve IT on the implementation of a platform, of a piece of software, ensure that you've ticked off the governance that sits around it, the compliance that they need to ensure, because that's their role within the organization, then they will allow the business departments to go off and use an approved tool within your organization. But they can certainly block you from implementing something after you've gone through all the process of automating it if they don't feel it was the right thing to do. And we've seen projects fail with it, with that, where the business department have gone off and done what they think was right. They haven't considered the wider picture. They engage IT at the point they want to go live, only to be told no because of X, Y, and Z. Something that they would have been able to potentially address had they engaged with IT earlier.
Excellent.